Taiwan has just had its best economic year in 15 years. GDP growth hit 8.63%, the highest since 2010. I'd argue the highest in the world right now. Per capita income reached $39,000. That's quite a bit for an Asian country, surpassing both Japan and South Korea for the first time. Consumer confidence climbed to a 9-month high, and the stock market keeps hitting record after record. And yet last year, 19 million Taiwanese, nearly 80% of the population, left the island at least once. The gap between outbound travelers and foreign arrivals reached 10.4 million people. The tourism deficit? About 22 million US dollars, roughly 3 times the defense budget the legislature just blocked. So here's the question. When an economy succeeds this spectacularly, why do its people send record amount of money leaving? And what does it mean when the same week the government celebrates attracting investment, its own economic research institute says land scarcity means companies can't invest domestically anyway? Well, today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of it. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socio-economic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.
Taiwan's economy minister has praised an economic dialogue started during the first Trump administration. Gong made the remarks in a speech at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. This marks his first official visit to the U.S. He also echoed the government's praise for the trade deal recently reached between Washington and Taipei. That agreement lowers Taiwan's tariff rate in exchange for more Taiwanese investment in U.S.-based chipmaking. During his D.C. visit, Gong also met with U.S. Undersecretary of State Jacob Helber. The two oversaw the signing of a joint statement on a U.S.-led secure semiconductor initiative.
Taiwan's tech sector, which accounts for more than 2/3 of the country's total exports, saw big gains as global demand for AI soared. That led Taiwan's total exports to surpass $50 billion in May. By year-end, they had reached over $60 billion, growing by an average of more than 40% during that period. Strong tech demand also boosted Taiwan's GDP growth forecast from around 3% to over 7%, following strong growth in the second half of the year. Behind the scenes, Taiwan continued to hold talks with the U.S. to get tariffs lowered. In August, negotiators announced the results of their initial discussions, a 20% tariff on top of existing duties. By mid-January, after months of negotiations, Taiwan and the U.S. agreed to lower tariffs on most goods to 15%. It was welcomed by the exporters, who say it reduced some trade uncertainty and put Taiwan on par with competitors like Japan and South Korea. Despite industry optimism, the deal comes with a steep price tag. $500 billion, half which is Taiwanese investment in U.S. chip making, and the other half through government-backed loans. It's raised concerns about hollowing out of Taiwan's critical semiconductor sector. The supercharged investment in the U.S. is one challenge to Taiwan's economy, but experts also warn of uneven growth as traditional sectors fall behind. Still, record high for investment, continuing demand for AI, and a sustained stock market rally point to a strong 2026. The outlook has companies like some firm feeling a bit more upbeat as they rush orders ahead of the Lunar New Year, while still bracing for more uncertainty ahead.
Taiwan's 2025 was historic by almost any measure. The 8.63% GDP growth beat not just forecast, it crossed them by 1.26 percentage points. It outpaced China at 5%, Singapore at 4.8%, Hong Kong at 3.5%, and South Korea at just 1%. The Director General of Budget, Accounting and Statistics announced this past week with appropriate fanfare, fourth quarter growth alone came in at 12.68%, nearly 5 percentage points higher than the earlier projection. Artificial intelligence, of course, is driving demand, semiconductor exports, the absence of tariffs on tech products, everything aligned. Per capita GDP tells the same story. At about $39,000, Taiwan now sits above Japan's $34,000 and South Korea's $35,000. The new Taiwan dollar strengthened 11.2% against the US dollar, depreciating during the reporting period. Investment incentives attracted $83 billion in pledged commitment from just under 2,000 companies. German direct investments surged 264% year on year to $209 million. The American Chamber of Commerce survey found 92% of member companies plan to maintain or increase their Taiwan investments. And on the other side, consumer confidence rose to 67.16 in January. That's the highest reading since April last year when Trump announced the tariffs. Every sub-index improved. Economic outlook, stock market sentiment, family finance, employment prospect, even expectations for durable goods purchases like cars, houses. The tariff deal with the United States, cutting the rate to 15% from 20%, provided a lot of relief. Markets rallied, analysts upgraded forecasts. This is what economic success looks like, at least on the books. And this is what policymakers point to when they talk about Taiwan's resilience, its technological advances, its critical role in global supply chains. By every conventional metric, Taiwan is winning. And yet, while the government was announcing GDP growth, the Tourism Administration was releasing its own numbers. In 2025, 18.94 million Taiwanese travelers went abroad, up 12.43% from the previous year. That's not just a new record. That's nearly 4 out of every 5 person in Taiwan leaving the country at least once. Foreign arrivals totaled 8.54 million, up 9%, yes, respectable growth, but the gap between the ones leaving and the ones coming in, 10.4 million people, tells a different story than the GDP numbers, doesn't it? The financial picture is even starker. The average Taiwanese travelers spent about just under $2,000 overseas in 2024. Foreign visitors to Taiwan spent just over $1,000 US, that is, on average during their stay. Do the math, and there's about 18.94 million outbound trips versus 8.57 million inbound visits. And the tourism deficit comes to approximately $22 billion US. The Tourism Administration attributes this to several factors. Favorable exchange rates for foreign destinations like Japan, whose currency absolutely plummeted over the last couple of years, increased flight capacity post-COVID, and foreign countries easing visa requirements for Taiwanese travelers. All true, but those are explanations for how people are leaving, not why they're choosing to leave in such numbers. The question isn't whether Taiwanese can afford to travel. Clearly, they can, and they are. The question is, what are they buying abroad that they can't find at home? Well, the same week the Tourism Administration released its deficit numbers, Taiwan Institute of Economic Research President Zhang Qianyi made a statement that should have attracted more attention than it did. Asked about the tentative U.S. trade agreement and concerns that Taiwan's semiconductor companies would quote-unquote hollow out the domestic economy by investing so much, two promises of $250 billion US in America, Zhang said something quite revealing, saying regardless of tariffs, these companies would not necessarily invest in Taiwan, as limited land availability remains a constraint on domestic investment. That's the pivot point. He added with refreshing directness, after all, we're not going to have a TSMC facility in Taipei's Xinyi district. That is, by the way, the booming business district in northern Taiwan, inside the capital. Think about that for a moment. The government just spent the previous week celebrating how its investment incentive programs attracted $83 billion US in commitments. 3 programs launched in 2019 to encourage both Taiwanese companies returning from abroad and domestic corporations to invest locally. The Ministry of Economic Affairs announced plans to attract an additional $38 billion US by next year, bringing in total accumulated investment to at least $114 billion US. But The head of Taiwan's leading economic research institute is saying land constraints means companies wouldn't invest here anyway. This isn't a minor technical detail. This is the fundamental constraint that shapes every other choice Taiwan makes. You can offer tax incentives, streamline permitting, subsidized electricity. You can negotiate trade deals and forge semiconductor alliances, but if there's physically no room to build the factories, none of that matters. Taiwan's total land area is 36,000 square kilometers, about 13,000 square miles. For comparison, that's roughly the size of the Netherlands, but with 60% of the land covered by mountains. Usable land for industry, housing, and agriculture, and everything else is squeezed into an ever-shrinking coastal plain. And much of that is already spoken for. The constraint isn't hypothetical, it's geological. Now that geology seems nice when you're talking about defending the island, but not when you want to grow it. Here's where the tourism numbers and the semiconductor investments start to tell the same story. When Taiwan's leading economic research institute's head was asked why companies can't invest domestically due to land constraints, he wasn't describing a failure of policy. He was describing what happens when an economy succeeds so completely that it literally runs out of room for its own growth. The billions and billions of tourism deficit isn't Taiwanese people fleeing a struggling economy. It's what prosperity looks like when there's nowhere left to expand or, well, play. The strong new Taiwanese dollars, up 11.2% against the US dollars during the reporting period, gives Taiwanese people unprecedented purchasing power abroad. Tokyo, Seoul, Bangkok, even European cities become accessible in ways they weren't a decade ago. But purchasing power explains capacity, not motivation. Why do Taiwanese people choose to spend that money elsewhere? What are they buying? Or maybe the right question is, what can't they buy in Taiwan? Well, space, for one. Japan's per capita land area is still larger than Taiwan's usable land per person. Even crowded Seoul in South Korea has more park space per capita than Taipei. The leisure economy, resorts, theme parks, hiking trails that don't require a 3 a.m. start to beat the crowd, exists at a scale Taiwan simply cannot provide. And for anyone with kids, I certainly do have them, you understand. Shopping malls, there are many. Just inside Taipei alone, I can name maybe 10 to 20 off the top of my head. But you never want to go to them on weekends because they're always crowded. Novelty for another, here on the island, when you live on a 394-kilometer long island, even domestic tourism reaches its limit. There are only so many night markets, mountain trails, coastal drives. The staycation economy has a ceiling in a place this small. And perhaps most significantly, escape. Not from hardship, but from density. Taiwan's population density in urban areas ranks among the highest in the world. The tourism deficit is what happens when economic success provides the means to temporarily escape at density, even as the success itself makes the density unavoidable. Now, of course, there's one thing that we absolutely need to talk about: Netflix special's recent coverage of Alex Honnold's free soloing of Taipei 101. They did it on a beautiful day, which I think is going to encourage even more people coming into Taipei to spend money. But I'm going to say after a few days, they're going to find out that there's only so much that you can do here in Taiwan. But hey, it is going to offset a little bit of that deficit between outbound travelers or outbound Taiwanese travelers and inbound foreign visitors. But the same logic applies to corporations. TSMC, PowerTech, Phoenix Silicon, they're not moving production offshore because Taiwan failed them. They're moving because they succeeded so well that Taiwan can no longer contain their next phase of growth. They need land, giant manufacturing buildings. And so this is where, when you talk about a country like, say, Canada, the second largest in the world next to Russia, it's got huge land masses, and sometimes you wonder, aside from natural resources, what can you do with that land? Well, this is a fine example. At least you will never run out of places to build large warehouses or fabrication labs. This isn't unique to Taiwan. Small, successful economies hit physical constraints all the time. The question is how they respond. Singapore, for example, when faced with similar land scarcity, has spent decades on aggressive land reclamation, adding roughly 25% to its total land area since independence. It's also developing integrated economic zones with, for example, neighboring Johor in Malaysia, essentially expanding its economic footprint beyond its borders through industrial partnerships rather than territorial expansion. Hong Kong's response was different, integration into the Greater Bay Area Development Plan, accepting that its future growth depends on functional economic unity with Shenzhen and Guangzhou, the high-speed rail connection, the bridge to Macau and Zhuhai, infrastructure as acknowledgement that success requires expanding beyond the constraint. The Netherlands, with similar population density and land challenges, has pursued radical agricultural intensification, becoming the world's second largest agricultural exporter despite its size, while also pioneering offshore wind energy and vertical farming to maximize limited space. Taiwan has pursued none of these strategies at scale. Land reclamation remains politically sensitive and environmentally controversial, and it's an island country. Converting agricultural land to industrial ones faces fierce resistance, both from farming constituencies and environmental groups. Cross-strait infrastructure integration is politically impossible. Offshore wind development is progressing, but very slowly. What Taiwan has done instead is export its constraint. Not through deliberate policy so much as through the accumulated choices of millions of individuals and hundreds of corporations, all making rational calculations about where to deploy their next dollar or next factory. The result is an economy that succeeds by expanding outward while remaining physically bounded inward. The tourism deficit and the $250 billion times 2 semiconductor commitment aren't separate phenomena. They're the same response to the same constraint, playing out at different scales. When you can't grow at home, you gotta grow abroad. Whether you are a person looking to book a flight to Tokyo, for example, or a company that builds a fab in Arizona, for example. Financial analysts have recently revised their outlook for the US economy. They've moved from predicting a hard landing, quote unquote, to a soft landing, which are basically recession or a gentle slowdown to economy, to what they now call no landing, an economy that stays strong with sticky inflation and limited rate cuts and just keeps taking off, where growth continues but rates stay higher longer. Taiwan's situation is a bit different. I mean, yes, the economy is growing quite rapidly, 8.63% last year, very strong and likely strong again this year, but the landing, quote unquote, is actually more physically, talking about how in Taiwan, the traditional sense of building more factories, more housing, more infrastructure, there's just nowhere for it to actually physically land these things. So it has to land elsewhere. Arizona fabs and Tokyo hotel rooms and Seoul shopping districts, the economic activity still happens, they just happen elsewhere. This creates a strange dynamic. Consumer confidence rises, people feel wealthier, more secure, more optimistic about family finances. The stock market hits record highs as semiconductor companies book years of future orders, and simultaneously, record numbers of people are choosing to spend their wealth abroad, and record amount of corporate investment flow offshore. Both things are true. Confidence is real. The exit is also real. They're not contradictory. They're complementary in the case of Taiwan. So maybe the tourism deficit in the offshore semiconductor investments aren't problems to be solved. Maybe they're adaptations to a constraint that can't be overcome. Taiwan has run out of land while still running hot economically. The solution is to arrive at millions of individual choices rather than central planning. It's to keep the economic engine in Taiwan while letting the outputs maybe flow a little bit outward. Or maybe it's a warming sign that economic success without physical space to expand creates a kind of prosperity that feels temporary. Strong balance sheet and full flights out. Confidence measured in how much you can afford to leave, not how much you can build at home. How do we solve it? Well, that is quite a pickle that the Taiwanese administrations have been dealing with. Opposition parties either don't understand it or conveniently ignore this fact. So we'll continue to cover this land issue or no landing issue here in Taiwan. And thank you for listening to the show. I'm Joey Chow. Tune in next week to find out more about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.